Welcome back to ESG Decoded. This is Amanda Hsieh, and today I have with me Elizabeth Carlson. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer of Tricon Energy, and I'm really excited to be talking to Elizabeth to learn more about Tricon's approach to responsible sourcing, how they're thinking about human rights in their supply chain, circular economy, and a lot of other fun stuff. Elizabeth, hi, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making time for this. Will you tell our listeners a little bit about Tricon Energy, first of all?
Yeah, sure. So Tricon is a chemical trading and distribution company. We've been in business about 26 years. We're headquartered in Houston, but we work around the world. We have business relationships in probably close to 140 countries and about 500 employees around the world. And really what chemical trading and distribution is, for those who may not be familiar, we essentially, buy and sell a lot of different raw materials, fertilizers, petrochemicals, plastics, and we manage financing, risk management, logistics, and market intelligence around those different products.
So how is Tricon approaching responsible sourcing? It's, of course, as your unique position in the very complex supply chains, I can imagine there's a lot of things to manage, a lot of risks to manage, but perhaps also opportunities. But tell us more about how the overall approach, first of all.
Right. When I joined Tricon, that was actually my first question about a year ago. How do we do sustainability as a trading and distribution company? For me, coming from construction and oil and gas and places where you have very clear physical assets and tangible impacts, it makes sense, right? How you can do environmental and social performance. But when you're in the middle of the value chain and you're dealing with very large chemical producers, small mom and pop shops, converters, customers who make many different products, and these chemicals are essentially the raw materials or the building blocks that impact so much in our society, it's a little bit confusing, right? Because your direct impacts are relatively small compared to the overall value chain impacts. And we did our materiality and risk assessment. That was very clear that the value chain was a key part of what we do, whether it's carbon, circularity, human rights, social impact. A lot of these issues are embedded in the value chain. So the way we approached this was to make three sort of sustainability pillars. The first around social and economic inclusion, the second on environment and climate, and the third on circular economy, which, would sound pretty standard for the chemical industry. But we underlaid those with a foundation of governance. And that's where we put responsible sourcing and product stewardship, saying that, okay, for everything we do, we have to look at it from three angles. How does it work in our company and for our people? How does it impact the industry as a whole, the value chain, as well as the communities and broader society? And that's kind of the perspective we take from responsible sourcing, that it's crossing all the pillars that we have. And the first step for us was really publishing a responsible sourcing and product stewardship standard, which, we feel like is aligned with good practice and sort of setting out the minimum requirements around the world, the expectations we have for suppliers and even for customers to an extent on the product stewardship side. And we're rolling that out via a process that's very common in trading and distribution called the KYC, or Know Your Customer, Know Your Counterparty. And we basically put that question and the link to the responsible sourcing standard in that form. But now we're looking at how do we actually improve the efficiency and the efficacy of due diligence across the board, not just the kind of check the box actions that we traditionally think of with due diligence, but how do we actually create impact beyond just getting someone to accept a contract clause or, submit a policy or something like that? How do we really move the needle on ESG issues in the value chain? And that's really where we are. It's a challenge because of leverage. So we don't have the same influence and control over every supplier, every customer, the way we would, as a larger company or as a more, pronounced figure in the value chain if we were actually producing the products or actually consuming them. But we still feel like everyone has their part to play, and that our company can kind of show the example of what it means to do sustainability. When you are in this position, you can still make an impact no matter how big or small. You can join in multi-stakeholder collaboration. You can set the expectations and really start to work together with all these customers and all these suppliers across these 100 plus countries to move the needle on how we see the norm of doing business when it comes to sustainability.
I have a couple of follow-up questions on that. One, are typically when we think about supply chain, we're thinking about more of a compliance. Are you complying to our code of conduct? Are you in line adhering to it? Are you meeting? Is there, making sure there's no child labor, for example, or forced and bond labor on our supply chain, things like that. Are you thinking, when you talk about impact, is it more than compliance? It sounds like it is.
Yeah, I think the starting point is always compliance. And for
Yeah.
the code, for the standard that we put together, we went beyond compliance from a global standpoint. So of course, certain jurisdictions, compliance will be much higher than our standard if you're looking at Europe or certain places. But in other locations, the regulation will be lower. And so we wanted to set kind of a global minimum threshold of what we think is responsible at a very basic level for any type of business across the different types of players that we interact with. But I think that's the challenge that all of us face in due diligence is how do we take it from, a check the box exercise to actually influencing suppliers or business partners for good. And that's where we're working right now. I wouldn't say that we've figured this all out or achieved it, but our plans, things that we're thinking about, for example, is putting together a supplier incentive program next year where we could actually, we're doing a lot of research and discussions to try to figure out like what would be the best way to do that to where suppliers would actually use it and help us to frame the program in a way that it would actually help them and not just become something that, we offer, but no one actually takes advantage of because it's not applicable to them. But we're thinking about how we could set up a fund, how we could do financing terms, contract terms, different types of incentives that would allow our suppliers, especially smaller ones, to take really meaningful actions, whether that's installing solar panels on a warehouse or that's improving health and safety, in a low income country with very challenging conditions in logistics, for example. So those are the kind of the things we're talking through and trying to formulate programs. But I think that's a challenge for all of us that we're looking at with industry is due diligence traditionally has been minimum standards, thresholds. How do we move to the next step to actually making an impact on how things are done?
The other question I wanted to ask you, you said there's kind of three main questions that you're asking, right? What can you, our employees, for the communities, and I forget the third one. Tell us a little bit more about those. And is there ever a case where maybe they're at conflict, at odds with each other? I don't know. I'm curious. But tell us more about maybe the three of those. And then has there ever been a case of where, it's maybe the answer is yes, yes, no, or something. I don't know. What happens? Or is there ever, or has that ever been like that? Or
I don't know that we've had a case where there's been a conflict between those three aims. I think it's a question of sort of how we invest our resources and where we focus, because with ESG, you can go in so many different directions, right? And you could spend so much time on community, you can spend so much time on employees, you can spend so much time on industry or suppliers and customers and value chain change. And so how do you allocate your resources and your focus, really? And that's where, sometimes it becomes a conflict. I think, a lot of our leadership, we really strongly believe, obviously, that first is the inside, right? You want to make sure that you're doing things right for your employees. It doesn't do much good to help the community if you're not, paying everyone fair compensation and giving them, different sorts of benefits and opportunities to grow their career. So there's always that sort of bias to try to start internally and see what you can do. But we're really trying to tackle all three at the same time on some level. So if we take something like waste, when it comes to internal, the amount of waste we generate is so small compared to the overall industry impacts of our industry. But we still want to have that zero waste to landfill goal. And we're still working through and making those changes, especially in our bigger offices, to get to zero waste to landfill, because for us it's important that that culture is part of our employees and part of what we do as a company, and that we set the example, even if it's a smaller impact. But at the same time, we're working with our logistics suppliers to say, can you implement different waste management schemes in warehousing, for example, or we're working, with plastic waste through multi-stakeholder collaboration with the Alliance to End Plastic Waste to say, how can we all get together and make sure plastics end use is responsible, that there's recycling infrastructure, that there's education, that the product design and all the elements of circular economy are integrated into how we work across the value chain when it comes to these products. And then at the same time, we're investing in community recycling infrastructure. I'm about to launch one of our first social investment projects around social inclusion in the recycling value chain in local communities. So we're trying to tackle at each level. It's just a matter of making sure that we can balance all those different priorities and stakeholders and really make an impact and not spread ourselves too thin as a smaller company.
Maybe that's another question. How many people do you have on the sustainability team? Because it's a lot of things to achieve. Or how have you delegated or maybe embedded sustainability in other colleagues' or responsibilities? How are you? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that too.
Yeah. So I'm on my own right now when it comes to sustainability from a strict, job title standpoint.
Yeah.
So I cover everything from sustainability reporting to representing, Tricon in different industry alliances to the day-to-day, try to implement programs and oversee and monitor and evaluate and so on, and the strategy. But I think the really nice thing about Tricon, and something that maybe is an advantage for other small companies as well, is just the agility of being able to take action. So when you work, I come from working in very large organizations, and oftentimes it just takes time, right? You have a lot of people to get on board. There's a bureaucracy, there's a system, and it can be challenging to navigate all of those internal politics and to really achieve something tangible. And for me and Tricon, it's been a nice change because we are smaller. We have 500 people, like I said, around the world. It's a little bit easier to navigate. We're a little bit more decentralized, and there's a culture of empowerment and empowering decision making, which allows me to put in place different processes or policies or new actions more quickly than I might be able to do in another situation. But we do have a sustainability committee, so I always recommend sustainability committees where we have our CEO and we have other executives and leaders on that committee. We meet monthly, we talk about our strategy, we talk about specific challenges, specific opportunities. And then we really just try to work with each office that we have locally to see what we can do and to make sure that the programs we develop are really, especially on the internal side, are really globally applicable, which can be a challenge. For example, we did an employee incentive program giving employees a financial incentive to take sustainable actions at home. And what we found is the first iteration of that program was a little bit biased towards the West, right? We were offering renewable energy plan incentives and solar panels. And these kinds of things are more accessible in certain countries than other countries, right? The US has, Texas especially has a great market for renewable energy plans, but that's not true everywhere else in the world. Mm-hmm. So we, were able to work with our offices and expand that to include, for example, biking to work, which is very common in Europe, but then also electric scooters and electric bikes, which are very common in Asia. And so trying to just work with different champions in the offices to make sure the programs we implement have that relevance and meet the needs that they have both internally but also with customers and suppliers locally.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's one of the questions I get a lot from our clients is, do I need to hire a sustainability team? Can I run it by a committee? How do I set this up? Because it just obviously change needs to happen, and we need people to make that change. And how do I get the most effort results with, what do I need to do that, and how many people and stuff like that. So I think it's always interesting to learn how other people are managing it and how they've set up their organization. A question I wanted to ask you is something that I've heard you say more than once, is you talk about a human rights framework versus an ESG framework, but will you tell us more about what a human rights framework is?
Yeah, I'm coming into sustainability with a social bias. My early days and sort of my background has been more on the community impact side and the people impact side. And of course, nowadays sustainability professionals come from all different backgrounds, but that certainly is my bias. And human rights remains my favorite approach to ESG issues. If we look at company performance on non-technical risk or impacts to the environment and society, and we look back to when I first started working in this field almost 15 years ago, we used to talk about corporate social responsibility. Then we sort of moved into that human rights framework with the UN guiding principles circa 2010. And then sustainability really rose to the top over the last few years. And now every article you read, right, in the media or business journals is talking about ESG. And what does that mean? I still think human rights together with corporate sustainability, and what I mean by corporate sustainability is delivering long-term value in social, ethical, financial, and environmental terms, is the right way to frame ESG issues. And that we really have to keep those human rights and sustainability, talking about the full social, ethical, financial, environmental, at the forefront of ESG conversations. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first for me is that human rights frameworks allow us to see the gray, right? People
Mm.
equate ESG with ratings or scores, but in human rights, we know it's not always black and white. Decisions that companies have to make in very complex operating environments. I mean, for us, working in 140 countries, working in the Middle East, working in Asia, working in Europe, working in South America, there are a lot of different pulls and pushes, and we have to make these decisions with a moral framework and a financial framework. And you can't always reduce that to a 1 to 10 decision, right? You can't always make that a clear number. You have to really debate complex impacts long term as well as short term. And a company that checks the box, like we were talking about with due diligence, doesn't necessarily have the best impact on society and the environment. The other thing I like about a human rights framework is that it really gives us a way of talking about our relationship with impacts. So there are those, when we talk about a human rights framework, we talk about impacts that we directly cause as a company, like how we treat our employees. And that goes back to, what I was talking about earlier with the different leverage that we have. So when it's a directly caused impact, we can control it, right? That's on us. We have to solve it. If we have a human rights violation, if we have poor environmental practices directly, we have to take action on that. But then there are impacts that we contribute to, like we could hire a company that has a poor environmental track record to outsource our emissions, right? Or outsource spills and pollution. And then finally, you have impacts that are linked by business relationships. And those are the most complicated. And that's where human rights, sort of is like predating the scopes of carbon footprint, because you can say, from a human rights standpoint, it doesn't help us to reduce our carbon footprint if we're outsourcing emissions, right? It might look better on paper, it might look better on an ESG scorecard, but it's not going to deliver value. It's not going to respect future generations' right to a clean environment. And then I think it recognizes that piece of leverage. You can stop something if it's in your control, you can influence it or address it if you're contributing to it. And then when it's across the value chain, you have to look at the different kinds of leverage available, whether that's multi-stakeholder collaboration, whether it's some kind of contractual influence, but it really gives you the language to talk about how you can address ESG issues across these different types of relationships that you have in a very complex value chain.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's something that sometimes is lost in the conversation because we get so focused on what is the score, what is the rating, right? What are our peers doing, and what do we need to do to make sure we're competitive and or exceeding them. But sometimes we lose that grounding. Maybe I can say it that way. That being grounded in human rights and looking at it that way. And it thinking about what you're talking about, like how much leverage do you have, and it really depends on your relationship, and depending on that leverage, it's also how it kind of determines the way, the path forward as well. I think that's a really interesting thing to reflect on as well and consider. I know that we just have a few minutes left, so I thought It might be interesting to hear more about Tricon, and you mentioned circular economy a little bit earlier. Can we dive into that a little bit more? Will you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, for us, since we do primarily work in these, chemicals and raw materials that are really building blocks for society, even though we're in the middle of the value chain, we feel like it's important to talk about not just a climate transition, but actually a circular transition as well. And I mean by that, just starting to shift our business models, our consumption patterns, the way we as society, not, Tricon specifically, we don't design products, but the way we put products together, the way waste management is processed to this circular model. And I think this is a massive business opportunity. The market's estimated, I think, around $4.5 trillion. Many companies and industries are resisting this change and sometimes even fighting regulation and these new models. But for us, I think we see the smart business decision as looking at this as an opportunity, right? This is where the future is going. How do we be part of that? How do we make sustainability, good for people, good for planet, good for the bottom line, right? Not always a win-win, but there are definitely examples where it can be. And we also look at our current portfolio and we say, okay, the primary products we buy and sell are what I would call like traditional products, right? It's the same products we've been using for a long, long time in our society. And that includes many petroleum-based products, that includes plastics, right? But we have to look and say, how do we achieve growth in our portfolio looking at a net zero future, a net zero by 2050 future in other types of products, whether that's different raw materials that will come on the market or that are required for the energy transition, or whether that's traditional products that have been recycled, that are coming from renewable resources, or maybe that have achieved processes to actually reduce the carbon footprint of those raw materials, right? And that's what we call low carbon products. So that's a really big piece of circular economy for us, is that we're in the middle of the value chain. There's a lot of market issues around making circular products and renewable products, making them work in business models. And we see our, capabilities in risk management and in market intelligence and in the ability to move products around the world where supply and demand might be mismatched as an opportunity to really enable the profitability of some of these more sustainable products. But it's not just about the business model. Like I said earlier, we have to also look to our office culture. We have to look at what we're using and consuming. We have to work with logistics, suppliers. We have to help our clients not just see this market, but actually access the opportunities that some of this new regulation and some of these changes bring. And then I think I mentioned before, but multi-stakeholder collaboration on circular economy is critical for us. We're not going to solve that on our own, right? So for us, we joined the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, which is a really unique organization in the sense that it extends across the entire value chain of different types of plastic packaging and products. Everybody from the raw material producers to those in the middle, like us, to the converters and packagers, to the brands who make the end product or sell the end product. And that alliance, really looks at addressing the bottlenecks that sort of hinder the circular economy from really rising up, especially when it comes to recycled products, through, behavior change, design challenges, investments in waste collection and recycling infrastructure. And so we're very supportive of that mission because, if we're going to make it to all of the Paris Agreement goals and we're going to make it to the commitments that brands have made toward, using more recycled products and using more circular and renewable resources, we all have to work together toward that end, and we have to be very creative and make markets themselves more sustainable overall. So that's a quick summary of kind of how we look at circular economy, but obviously a very complex subject.
Very complex subject, and I always think that for most industries, there's multiple pathways to reach Paris. They might be expensive, but we kind of generally know the general pathways. But really, to get to a circular economy, maybe even a regenerative economy, those pathways are not very well defined. And again, I think about, we can decouple emissions and production today. I mean, it may not be expensive, it may not be efficient, but there's ways we can do that. We know those pathways. But if we really want to decouple production with extraction, there's not really well-defined pathways there today. So it's a lot of innovation and creativity needed. And I take your point too about collaboration. I was at a conference in Atlanta about a few months ago, and that was one of the main key messages there, that we need to collaborate across the supply chain. I think it's just like any other large global crisis. No one company, no one country, no one individual, no one, organization is going to solve it. We really have to team up and collaborate to address this issue. Elizabeth, thank you so much for just sharing some highlights. I know there's so much more we can go into, but I appreciate you sharing some highlights with Tricon. We'll also link Tricon's webpage and also the link to the sustainability report so folks can read more and get a little bit more detail about what you described today. But thank you so much.
No, thank you.